Hi everyone. Thanks for coming out on a Friday afternoon. It's great to see everyone out here for this really important and looks to be interesting colloquium. My name is Samantha Matthews. I'm a PhD student in the Department of Sociology and Anthropology and a member of the colloquium committee for this department. So I'm just going to give you a brief rundown of what the colloquium is going to be about today, and then we'll get started with our speakers. So since the 1916 Sykes-Picot Agreement, which aimed at dividing the Middle East between Britain and France, Western imperialist plans and designs to keep the Middle East fragmented, unstable, and under U.S. imperialist control have never stopped. The establishment in 1948 of the State of Israel, with the help of British colonialism and the resultant forced expulsion of about 80% of the Palestinian people and the destruction of their homes, villages, and towns, has ushered in a new geo-political core deemed by U.S. imperialism essential to its global hegemony. Since then, the U.S., with the help of Israel, has made sure that no Arab country will be allowed to be independent or sovereign. Any attempt at defying imperialist dictates, as history has shown us in Iraq, Libya, Yemen, and today in Syria, was met with U.S. direct and indirect force, violence, and destruction. This discussion today deals with some of the issues I just raised, and it will pay special attention to the U.S. role and the Russian presence in Syria. So today our panel consists of three speakers. We're going to hear from Professor Nahla Abdo from the Department of Sociology and Anthropology here at Carleton, Professor Peter Gose, who's also from the Department of Sociology and Anthropology here at Carleton, and Dr. Phillip Leech-Ngo, who is a Gordon F. Henderson postdoctoral fellow from the Human Rights Research and Education Center at the University of Ottawa.
My presentation will be making a connection between Israel, Palestine, and Syria, but within the context of imperialism, past and present. So, to begin with, the poster which was distributed actually is right here, about 1916. This month, the Arabs commemorate 100 years of the first imperialist onslaught on the Middle East, initiated by the 1916 Sykes-Picot Agreement, which literally divided the Middle East between the two hegemonic imperial powers, Britain and France, where literally two diplomats, one British, Sykes, and one French, Picot, sat together in the dark, took their pencils and drew a new map for the Middle East, one that divides the whole of the Middle East. And it was a secret agreement until it was revealed a bit later. Basically, the new map was divided to be sort of picture of what each imperialist country at the time needed or wanted to see in the Middle East. This agreement was called by Lenin actually as the agreement of the colonial thieves. The importance of remembering the Sykes-Picot is not only to set the historical records straight. The replacement of the multiple colonial thieves with one imperial thief called the US and the latter's policies in the last decade or so, which resulted in US-Israel's devastation of Lebanon in 2006, the destruction of Iraq, Libya, Yemen, and the current onslaught on Syria, are all part of redrawing the map of the Middle East, or in the words of Condoleezza Rice, whom I'm sure many of you remember, in order to create a new Middle East amenable to our interests. The difference, perhaps, is in the secrecy of the first imperial design and the public announcement of this one by Condoleezza Rice. In this month also, Palestinians commemorate 99th year of the 1917 Balfour Declaration, where Britain's Foreign Secretary, Arthur Balfour, signed a declaration with Baron Rothschild a prominent Zionist and a friend of Chaim Weizmann, stating the agreement that His Majesty's government view with favor the establishment in Palestine of a national home for the Jewish people and will use their best endeavors to facilitate the achievement of this project, ushering in, of course, the creation of the Zionist settler colonial project in Palestine and the establishment of the State of Israel. Since then, not only the Palestinians, but all Arab countries have been in a turmoil, with Israel taking a major part in this turmoil. Israel has been and continues to be at the center of every imperialist war in the Arab world, from Iraq to Libya to Syria to Yemen. Before I tell you what am I presenting now, I thought this map is quite telling. This is the map of 1916, where, look at this. This is Palestine, the yellow one, but it has no name. All is mentioned here are two cities in Palestine, Haifa and Jerusalem. There is no Palestine. The attempt basically at designating Palestine under particular imperialist hegemonies was already in the 1916 Sykes-Picot Agreement. This whole area was called, until 1916, was called Greater Syria, where Lebanon, Palestine, the eastern part of the Jordan River, because Jordan as a country did not exist at the time, all of Lebanon, Syria, Palestine, and the eastern part of the Jordan River, all of them were under something called Greater Syria. The redivision of this map basically created new influence regions for the British and the French at the time. Now, with the decline of the British and the French, now you have U.S. influence in that area. And if you look at, what is green, what is less green, what is yellow, what is less yellow, you would see the imperial influence zones that were designed there. So that tells us something about how our countries, or how our borders actually defined, and how our countries created and recreated, or actually decimated in many cases. In my presentation, I will focus on what we here in the West know about Israel and what Israel actually is, namely the difference between propaganda and reality. At the end of my presentation, I will reconnect Israel with the existing imperialist war on Syria. So, hegemonic notions informing policies and practices circulated in the West, including in our Canada, about Israel-Palestine are largely based on a set of ideas and ideologies constructed and produced in Israel. These ideas and ideologies include Israel is a Jewish and democratic state. We have this notion or axiom, and the Palestinians are an ethnic minority, if at all they're considered. The West Bank and Gaza are occupied territories. The notion also that Israel has the right to exist as is, and no challenges acceptable, and that the solution to the Israel-Palestine conflict might be a two-state solution. How, when, and what are beside the point. With above rather hegemonic ideas, it becomes clear that we, all of us, academics, students, activists, civil society organizations, etc., have no right to criticize Israel or its Zionist ideology. Otherwise, you will be branded anti-Semitic, or if we happen to be Jewish, we will be Jew haters or traitors, regardless of where we stand on racism, including anti-Semitism, which we all are against, of course. Let me address some of the above axioms. First, is Israel a Jewish democracy and are Palestinians a minority? The answer, no, to both, has been established not only by the victims of Israel, but also by many analysts from all over the globe. But here, I would like to focus on Israeli Jewish authors mainly, those who take into account the demographic, territorial, and legal status of Palestinians under Israeli control. I start with a recent article, I'm sure some of you have or already seen it, by Gideon Levy, who writes in the Haaretz. I start with Gideon Levy, whose recent article in Haaretz was entitled, "Stop with the nonsense that Palestinians are a minority in Israel." The subtitle is, "You cannot argue that the Palestinians aren't an integral part of Greater Israel. Occupied? Yes. Dispossessed? Yes. But integral." In this article, Levy sends a strong message to the delusional Israelis and to the West, I would add, who live in a fallacy that Israel only controls its citizens, most of whom are Jews. Levy asserts, I'm quoting, "But nobody counts the millions of other subjects who fall under its control at least as much and maybe more. Accounting for the demographic aspect of Israel-Palestine, Levy found both Palestinians and Jews to be equal in numbers. 6.3 million Jews and 6.3 million, quoting him, invisible Palestinians. To the 1.8 million Arab citizens inside Israel, he adds 2.7 million Palestinians living under direct Israeli rule in the West Bank and about 1.8 million living under indirect Israeli rule in the Gaza Strip. This number, mind you, exclude the Palestinians who Israel expelled since the 48 Nakba and who number close to another 6 million Palestinians. The invisibility of the Palestinians, Levy argues, is only a matter of convenience to the Israelis. The fate of all these subjects, from registration at birth to the currency they use and most of their rights, is set in Israel. He adds, there is no way around that, not even with the help of 1,000 articles discussing the wonders of this delusion of Jewish democracy. Levy concludes, Israel is not Jewish. And if it insists on being Jewish by force, then it is definitely not democratic. Levy's position is not new. In the mid-1980s, Meron Benvenisti, a political scientist who was deputy mayor of Jerusalem from 1971 until 1978, was the first to put forward the thesis that Israel's hold over the territories beyond the Green Line, that is beyond 1967, has become permanent. So it's not really occupied. And that defining the territories as occupied, according to him, is misleading, as they have become incorporated into the Israeli system of control. A similar position was expressed by Yehuda Shenhav of Tel Aviv University, who, in his book called Beyond the Two-State Solution, argues, this is 2012, argues against the notion that there is still any meaningful distinction between Israel pre-67 boundaries and after 67 territories. Going back to Levy's article here, I would only replace his concept of invisibility with that of invisibilization to basically indicate the actual processes leading to invisibility. So invisibility was process or processes actually in the making and continue to be in the making. If above literature tells us what Israel is not, then what kind of a state is it? Extensive research has emerged on Israel's racist policies and practices towards its Palestinian subjects, to which Israel refers as non-Jews. So they're not even human beings, they're non-Jews. Both 48 citizens as well as 67 non-citizens. I use the concept racism here basically to refer to a system of power in the hands of the state which separates, discriminates against, exploits and oppresses an otherized group where othering could be based on racial, religious, ethnic or national grounds. Okay, so let's go to another characterization. Settler colonial apartheid between the academy and lived reality. For several decades now, international scholars, including Palestinian, Jewish, Israeli, and Canadians, have been engaged in the debate around the nature and character of the Zionist state, Israel. As early as 1973, well-known sociologist Maxime Rodinson wrote his book entitled Israel, a Colonial Settler State. There's no need to go into the book because he basically proves that Israel is a colonial settler state. While in 1987, Uri Davis wrote his seminal book entitled Israel, an Apartheid State. These theses were put forth much before the emergence of the Israeli new historians in 1990s. Historians like Ilan Pappé, Avi Shlaim, early Benny Morris, early, not late, Baruch Kimmerling, and others, who broke the taboo on Israeli official history of the creation of the state and the fate of most Palestinians made refugees. Terms used in describing the state in this literature include ethnic cleansing by Ilan Pappé and forced expulsion used by Benny Morris, Baruch Kimmerling, Avi Shlaim, among others. Yet, much before, during, and after the findings of the new historians, Israeli historians, Palestinian authors like Walid Khalidi, historians, Rashid Khalidi, Edward Said, Noor Masalha, and your speaker, among others, have been documenting through archival records and actual narratives of Palestinian women and men their Nakba, catastrophe, their Nakba ordeal. But Israel and the Western states chose to turn a deaf ear and a blind eye to this reality. After all, the reality which does not serve the imperialist interests is deemed irrelevant. Recent changes at the local, regional, and international levels have resulted in increased interest among academics and political analysts in the question of Israel-Palestine. At the local, regional level, I note the increased internal resistance among Palestinians, both inside Israel as citizens of the State of Israel, as well as in the occupied 67 territories of both the West Bank as well as Gaza. Also, we witness the annexation of the occupied Syrian Golan Heights and Israel's continuous attack on the Bedouins and its refusal to recognize over 45 villages, some of which actually existed before the state itself was established, all in an attempt to confiscate the land. Internationally, we also note a growing international solidarity with the Palestinians, especially through the BDS movement and the increased awareness of Palestinian conditions in general. All these have led to the renewal of the debate on the nature and character of the Israeli state. In 2002, Israeli scholars Gershon Shafir and Yoav Peled, who at least Yoav Peled is in Israel, still teaches there, wrote a book entitled Being Israeli, etc., where they described Zionism and the state as settler colonial with qualifications. They applied settler colonialism to the Zionist settler movement in pre-1948 Israel, or Palestine, of course, and to Israel's rule over the occupied territories of 1967, but denied that Israel is settler colonial to so-called Israel proper, that is, Israel 1948 up to 1967. Since the late 1990s, however, Noor Masalha has written extensively on Israel as a settler colonial state. Among his work, I would like to mention only one called the Palestinian Nakba, where he reminds us of the most important processes characteristic of the Zionist colonial project, processes of erasure, hence invisibilization that we talked about earlier. These are the de-Arabization of the land by geographically renaming and reconfiguring the landscape through the erasure of ancient Palestinian place names and their replacement with new Hebrew-sounding names. Toponymicide has been crucial in cementing the notion that Palestine/Israel is Jewish. Second process, politicide. Politicide, initially introduced by an Israeli scholar, Baruch Kimmerling, to refer to the ultimate dissolution of the Palestinian people's existence as a legitimate social, political, and economic entity. It also entailed denying the Palestinians any independent political existence in Palestine. This process aimed at obliterating the existence of a whole community and curbing their efforts of resistance and claims to self-determination. Nakba, memoricide, which denotes the systemic erasure of the expelled Palestinians and their mini-Holocaust, according to Masalha, to use his words, from Israeli collective memory, and the excision of their history and deeply rooted heritage in the land, and their destroyed villages and towns from Israeli popular memory. So your people, the Jews that settled in Palestine, have been worked on their brains to basically forget the Nakba and who was there, the indigenous people, the Aboriginal people. Nakba memoricide expressed recently in the new Israeli law, which denies Palestinians the right to commemorate the Nakba in public. Legal. This process is an attempt to erase Nakba memory from all citizens, that is, Palestinian citizens of Israel as well as Israeli Jewish citizens of Israel. To these all, we can add, and these are my concepts, we can debate them, economicide and cultural genocide, processes which removed the Palestinians from their land and consequently from their material and national culture. While such processes began with the Zionist settler movement, their conclusion was possible only after the Nakba, or what Ilan Pappy calls ethnic cleansing, a notion considered by many as a polite term for genocide, ethnic cleansing. In describing genocide or ethnic cleansing, Pappy argues it only took 6 months to systematically implement and execute Plan D, and that when it was over, more than half of Palestine's native population, over 750,000 people, had been uprooted, 531 villages had been destroyed, and 11 urban neighborhoods had been emptied of their inhabitants. We can discuss Plan Dalit later. Let me just note here that this information is vital in responding to the Zionist propaganda which denies responsibility over the expulsion of Palestinians or the use of violence, force, and massacres in the process of erasing the Palestinians and creating the State of Israel. The exclusionary and exclusivist policies used by the Zionist settler colonial movement, which reached an epic in 48 Nakba continued to characterize the nature of the state and its Zionist ideology. In the past decade or so, a large body of literature emerged reaffirming the settler colonial apartheid nature of the state. Apartheid in Palestine is a recent Canadian book with authors like Shireen Razak, Yasmin Abu Laban, Abigail Bakan, Edward Corrigan, and others discussing Israeli apartheid and settler colonial system within the occupied territories 1967. Another important book here is Israel and South Africa, Many Faces of Apartheid, very recent. This book included 10 contributors who contextualized Israel since 1948, unlike the first one, which basically focuses on after 67, that is the occupied territories. This one contextualizes Israel, so-called proper, within the settler colonial apartheid framework. While focusing on different aspects and emphases, authors compared Israeli apartheid with that of South Africa and other settler colonial states, including North America. To give just a few examples here, Ronnie Casrels, who criticizes Israel as a settler colonial apartheid state, draws comparisons between the Zionist state, to use his term, with South African apartheid, arguing that Israel is a worse kind of apartheid, according to him. He explains that while indigenous South Africans were placed in Bantustans and used as a source of cheap labor power, the Zionist state, and even before its establishment, aimed at getting rid of the indigenous Palestinians, turning the country into purely racial Jewish. Casrels, who was a member of the National Executive Committee of the ANC and has written extensively on the South African experience of apartheid, sees the anti-colonial liberation struggle as the way to end Israeli apartheid. Oren Ben-Dor, ex-Israeli also, another contributor, introduced the concept of originary. This is his concept. Originary apartheid, to argue that apartheid is an essential feature of the nature of the Zionist state. In contradistinction to those who see apartheid only in regards to the Palestinian territories occupied in 1967. He says the very nature of the state itself from its establishment is originary apartheid, or apartheid is very much implemented there. The author differentiates between de facto injustice, as in the case of North American settler colonialism, and what he calls inbuilt or originary injustice, as in the case of settler colonial Israel. The difference, according to him, resides in the ability of citizens in North America to change the legal injustices, unlike in the case of Israel, where Palestinians cannot. He finds Israel's ethnocracy to be... Did I do my 15? My 20? Oh, I did? Okay. Enough examples. But it would be fascinating, actually, to know, him and Virginia Tilley and the rest. What I do after that is I go into, for some reason I thought it's only 15 minutes. After that I go into the practicality and say that, actual practices and policies within Israel itself, okay, can be more important than just the theoretical sort of discussion that I presented here. And I look at research that was done through oral history with men and women, Palestinian men and women, and Israeli men and women, to look at the actual racism within the state of Israel. To conclude, and I look at apartheid in terms of how the economy is split into two economies, by the way, in Israel. Education is split into two kinds of education. Everything is into two parts. So apartheid is very much, implemented within Israel itself. I'm not talking about the West Bank and Gaza Strip now. Okay, let me conclude by saying that anti-colonial, anti-imperialist methodology, feminist or otherwise, is a requisite for understanding native, indigenous people living under settler colonialism. It allows us to understand and analyze the settler colonial state. Anti-colonial, anti-imperialist methodology allows us to see commonalities also between indigenous peoples globally and contributes to the struggle for the elimination of ethnic settler myths and racial discrimination. I'm going to stop here and just give you the last note, which reconnects Israel with what's happening right now in Syria. But since the second speaker is going to be talking more about Syria, I'll leave this to him. I thank you very much.
Okay, well, thanks for coming out, everyone. This is amazing to see so many people here. What I'd like to do is talk about the current Syrian civil war, proxy war, regime change war, whatever you want to call it, in the context of Sykes-Picot and all of these things. If the borders of Syria that were established by Sykes-Picot were, like so many national borders, arbitrary and colonially imposed and so forth, my main concern today is what happens when those borders and the whole nation-building processes that corresponded to them are, how to put it, subject to attack and subject to revision, not internally but largely by external forces. I would argue a war of aggression. We'll get to this down the road. So I'm looking at, so just as one can argue there was an imperial agenda behind Sykes-Picot, so one can argue nowadays there is also an imperial agenda in the undoing of Sykes-Picot, okay? And it's this latter part that I particularly want to address today, okay? So I particularly want to focus on why one party to this war in Syria, an alliance of like the US and NATO countries, Sunni fundamentalist states, namely like Saudi Arabia, the Gulf Emirates and Turkey, and last but not least, Israel. Well, I'm going to call them all for the sake of convenience, the axis of jihad here, this alliance of countries. Why are they pursuing a policy of like engineered state collapse in Syria? Like what's the agenda here, right? And I want to try to get into that. Like, in what world does it make sense to pursue this kind of a policy, and what interests might underwrite such a world? Okay. In order to do this, of course, I'm going to have to make, substantive claims about what's going on there, and all of this is very, very complicated, particularly in the, incredibly hyperbolic media environment, propaganda environment that surrounds all of the events in Syria these days, in which, which are basically trying to drum up support for a humanitarian intervention, and through mostly fabricated claims about, Assad the butcher murdering his own people, gassing them, barrel bombing them. The barrel bomb meme, of course, is the one that you can never omit in these things, and his unholy alliance with Putin, the new Hitler of our age, et cetera, et cetera, et cetera, right? So I'm going to, in order to get to the business about engineered state collapse, I'm also going to have to work through some of the propaganda, because I don't, the very challenge here is to, in a sense, get there's such different narratives at work in this situation that one has to kind of grapple with the propaganda environment in making the substantive claim and investigate the issues that I'd like to investigate. So I'm going to have to work through these things kind of simultaneously. So bear with me, ask questions if I didn't say enough, or if you don't agree with what I said, right? So I want to pick it up with, at a certain point in history, which is the Arab Spring, which is where the civil war narrative typically begins with Syria. As we'll see, there are much earlier events that we'll need to take into account here, but let's start there and work through it, okay? So basically, the notion here is that in the Arab world, in the spring of 2011, there were these sort of pro-democracy, anti-dictatorship movements that sprung up kind of like mushrooms from Tunisia through Egypt, and then arriving in Syria in February of 2011. Okay, and so indeed, this is the case. So one starts to see like somewhat critical of Assad demonstrations starting to happen in various Syrian cities as of February and into March of 2011. And it's very much like what was going on in Egypt and Tunisia and elsewhere in the Arab world at this time. However, in March, specifically March 17th and 18th in Syria, in the town of Daraa on the Jordanian border, what's going on in Syria starts to depart from what was going on in the rest of the Arab world during the Arab Spring. One starts to see like violent armed clashes in the streets, not just protesters out there chanting and with signs and that kind of thing, but gunfire in demonstrations, police being killed and demonstrators being killed as well. Okay, and this is a departure from the form that the Arab Spring had taken elsewhere, and it's, I would say, a pretty important one. Now, in this first demonstration on those dates in March in Daraa, 7 police were killed and 4 demonstrators were shot. This is not the pattern of casualties that you would expect if it was, government repression of a peaceful demonstration. But this is, of course, the Western narrative about what was going on here, right? And I could keep piling up this, example. And then in April we actually get an ambush of police and government forces on a road. So it's a very different kind of violence than one would expect. And there's actually reports in Daraa of like rooftop snipers, very much a la Maidan in the Ukraine a couple years later, right? So it's a different pattern, and one starts to see then that this phenomenon that we have a fairly established understanding of the Arab Spring starts to be converting, being hijacked, one could argue, into something else. I could, go sort of town by town and talk about a lot more examples that would serve to make this point. But let's just summarize the year 2011. And according to the UN, there were over 5,000 casualties in Syria during the year of 2011 in these supposedly anti-government protests. And their raw data shows that of those 5,000 casualties, 478 were police officers and 2,091 were military and security personnel. So, in other words, half the casualties of these 5,000 were either police or government military people. So this suggests some very elementary things about who's firing on who, right? That's the simple point that I'd like to make. If it was just a simple scenario of government repression, there certainly was that as well. I wouldn't deny it in any way. But it's clearly more complicated than that, right? Unless you're saying that the police are firing on themselves and the army's firing on themselves and so forth. So I think what we have to see at work in these things is the beginning of and the insertion of an armed insurrectionary component to them. And these weren't peaceful, unarmed protests, as our media at the time and since have continued to insist. Okay, and it's since become clear through first-person accounts, not just of Syrian activists who are pro-democracy, kind of Arab Spring kind of activists, but also jihadis themselves, that there were, jihadist elements that were recruited to do this, like painting slogans on mosques, for example, that would be calculated to offend, no God but Bashar, these kinds of things that were designed to, enrage Muslims in Syria and incite an uprising of that sort. And there's foreign jihadis who have since talked on record that they indeed were painting these kinds of slogans and had been hired to come in and basically stir things up. So let's just stop here. What am I saying? I'm saying for sure there was some degree of popular discontent against the Assad government, as there were in all the other Arab Spring manifestations. However, there was a hijacking of that, right, and a commandeering of this movement in a very, very different direction, turning it into a jihadist uprising, which had very little to do with the ostensible goals of the Arab Spring elsewhere, right? And this is a crucial point that we have to take into account. And, you know, over time it emerged that the force responsible for this hijacking, emerges basically in 2012 as Jabhat al-Nusra, a Syrian franchise of al-Qaeda funded by Saudi Arabia, Qatar, trained by the CIA primarily in Turkey, okay? It became the backbone of the armed attacks against the Assad government. And as these attacks mounted and became more serious during 2012, they increasingly kind of dismembered the country into a patchwork of military spheres of influence, each run by an uneasy coalition of local militias in the context of a dissolving state. There were like local, neighborhood-based and sheikh-based kinds of militias that were, in some senses, about local self-defense. In some kind of combination with overarching organizations, be those of the Syrian state, where it still hung on to territory, or those of al-Nusra, right? Those of Jabhat al-Nusra. So this is, by 2012, very much the situation we got. We got a disintegrating state here, and the government is very, during that year is very much on the retreat and is being kicked out of a lot of areas, right? So we've gone then from a peaceful pro-democracy kind of uprising to a violent jihadist insurrection and a state falling apart in remarkably short order. Okay, and again, it's been very difficult for large numbers of actors or external commentators, of which I'm certainly one, to make sense of this, and all kinds of like wish fulfillment has been dashed in this kind of thing. I think particularly of the Trotskyist International Socialist Organization in the United States that sees in all of this, a revolution in the making, and that it is all, a continuation of the Arab Spring, constantly, editing out, sanitizing the jihadist influence in all of these developments. We'll have a chance to address the anarchists later on. Anyway, the whole point, however, though, and what gets lost in all of this is that the al-Nusra Front was anything but revolutionary, and its most notorious acts would fit anybody's definition of terrorism. I give you, for example, the 2013 spectacle of Khaled Abu Sakar, an al-Nusra leader and field commander, who in front of cameras ate the heart and liver of a dead Syrian soldier, right? So there was a cannibal dimension to this wonderful revolutionary uprising. There's also on August 21st of 2013, a sarin gas attack on the Damascus suburb of East Ghouta, originally blamed on the Syrian government, but when MIT ballistics experts looked at the evidence of what happened, turned out that the missile that delivered the sarin gas had a very, very short range and could only have been fired from al-Nusra controlled territory. And then after that, it came out that the sarin gas and the ingredients that it was made from were supplied to the al-Nusra Front in Turkey, and the training to make it happen there. So, it looks like a false flag kind of event that was used as again, part of a big propaganda offensive for a no-fly zone, establishing an American no-fly zone in Syria, and to basically have a regime change kind of intervention at that point. So only Russia's intervention in September of 2013 prevented the U.S. from doing this, and we'll hopefully get back to Russia shortly, but I'll have to move on, if I want to stay within my time here. So meanwhile, we have in neighboring Iraq in the years 2011 to 13, the slow rise of ISIS that is made up of remnants of the Ba'athist army. When the Americans smashed the Iraqi state in 2003, they didn't bother to re-employ the members of the armed forces and all of this sort of thing. A lot of them were put in jails in, I believe, Bagram is where this occurred, and Abu Bakr al-Baghdadi, the putative leader of ISIS, was part of that contingent, and it's out of this milieu that ISIS emerged, right? And so, they're also a faction of al-Qaeda that differs mainly in one point, that they actually want to establish a caliphate, that is a territorial state that they would control, as opposed to simply being an armed force that would go in and mess things up like Al-Qaeda and al-Nusra. Okay, so and I'll argue later on that this is the foundations of Plan A and Plan B in Syria. Plan A being regime change and Plan B being territorial dismemberment of the Syrian state. Okay, so then we have the moral the horrific events of the summer of 2014 when our summer of 2014 when ISIS emerges around Mosul, takes over large stretches of territory in Iraq, drives the Syrian state virtually to the gates of Baghdad, and then starts expanding into Syria and sets up Raqqa as its capital and all of this. Okay, so this is kind of where we find ourselves towards the end of 2014. Is the Syrian state once again really being set back on its heels, right? There's now a second jihadist force that has entered, has definite designs of territorial control, and is pushing quite relentlessly into Aleppo and again into the outskirts of Damascus. And there starts to be real questions about the survival of the Syrian state as of this moment. Okay, I want to kind of pause this narrative of the events here and just make the obvious point that this is a war against Syria, but it's being fought by proxies. It's being fought by the al-Nusra Front and by ISIS, not by NATO, not by Israel or the Gulf states directly. This is an interesting development that contrasts, say, with earlier interventions in this area. I think of the American invasion of Iraq in 2003 when they sent their own army to do it. This time they're sending other people to do this. Well, why? Why does it take this form, right? Well, I think it takes this form because of the war weariness of the public in the West, of citizens in the West. So there's just simply not a lot of appetite for this. And I think there are other factors, so that accounts for the NATO part of the axis of jihad here. But I think there's also an Israeli dimension to it as well. You'll recall, Nahla mentioned it, that Israel attempted to fight a war in Lebanon in the summer of 2006, and indeed it bombed it back to the Stone Age from the air. But what is not often talked about as much is that they couldn't even cross into Lebanese territory on the ground, right? That Hezbollah held the line against them most resolutely. And so there's, this was incredibly frustrating for Israel, right? That, the most moral army in the world and supposedly the best armed and the most capable was stopped dead in its tracks, right? And could not advance. So what we see, I think, is another factor in the decision to go proxy in this conflict is Israel's unwillingness to fight a competent army on the ground, right? It doesn't want to be revealed as, less of a fighting force than its myth proclaims itself to be. So it's, in a sense, more convenient to contract out this part of the military struggle to others than it is to take it on personally. So both 2/3 then of the axis of jihad have, proximate problems of direct intervention that they're trying to avoid by proceeding this way. Okay. So under these circumstances, they went proxy. Again, I'm not going to belabor this, but anyone who thinks about it cannot fail to be impressed by the kind of monumental hypocrisy of this move, right? That here, these proxies are the ostensible enemy in the war on terror, right? They're supposed to be what we are fighting against. They're the ones who attacked us, on 9/11, all this sort of thing. And the U.S. continues to, justify large military budgets and interventions in this part of the world on the grounds of fighting terrorism, right? All the while, it is training and funding, along with its proxies, the very terrorist organizations that it claims to be fighting against, right? And they become its, the best word I've seen for it in all the literature that I've read is it's a regime change can opener in this part of the world, right? And that's, I think, a pretty fair characterization of it. So what we now have to account for, I think, is like, why did this nonetheless devolve? Why did it shift from regime change, keeping the borders of the Syrian state intact, which is, I think, what the al-Nusra intervention was initially intended to do, to a different strategy, which is one of like territorial dismemberment, right? Why did smashing the Syrian state start to emerge as the preferred way to go in this evolving conflict? And I think there's a number of like deep roots of this, what I'm going to call Plan B here, which is this. And so we can point to one that goes back to 1982 in Israel, the so-called Yemen Plan, which advocated for the Balkanization of surrounding Arab states along sectarian lines and fomenting internecine sectarian strife as a way of ensuring Israel's security. Okay, so this is one source of Plan B of this strategy. I think another source from approximately the same years would be the American arming, particularly with man pads like these shoulder rockets that can take down helicopters, of mujahideen in Afghanistan when the Soviets occupied it. So there was like, some, if you like, this is also another source of this plan, right? That we can get proxies to do our dirty work for us in this way, right? So these are aspects of Plan B, like part of the prehistory of Plan B, if you like, but not the full thing. In the immediate aftermath of 9/11, General Wesley Clark testified that when he went to the Pentagon, he was told that Syria was on a hit list of 7 Middle Eastern states targeted for regime change and invasion in the coming 5 years. And of those 7 states, Iraq and Libya were also members. Okay, so the Pentagon did make good on at least some of these threats. While these kind of wild regime change ambitions clearly were not met in their totality, they do seem to have nonetheless moved Syria up on the kind of priority list. So in 2009, when Syria actually refused to sign a pipeline agreement that would have allowed Qatari gas to be shipped through its eastern borders into Turkey, and from there to Europe, Assad said no, right? And this was the wrong answer. And it seems to have moved him up higher on the hit list. So what we start to see then is that this whole business actually predates the Arab Spring, right? There are machinations and work prior to that arguably seized on that to implement an attack on the Syrian state. I need to move on. So, it's difficult not to sort of obsess about the sheer criminality of these wars of aggression on formerly sovereign states and the destruction of so many societies and innocent lives and all of this. Like, I find it certainly hard to not get sidetracked and to keep trained on the question of why and what's going on here, right? But I think it's important to realize that this is a response to a changing geopolitical situation that itself came out of previous interventions, like particularly the Iraq War of 2003, right? Which toppled a secular regime in Iraq and a Sunni-dominated secular regime at that, established what, and now we'll have our other axis here, what's often called the Shia Crescent, or as they call themselves, the axis of resistance in this area. All of a sudden, there is a clear pathway from Iran to Lebanon, right? And a supply chain for Hezbollah coming from Iran and connecting this whole area, right? So what we see is that geopolitically, the previous interventions had backfired, right? They had not achieved their aims that the Axis of Jihad had hoped for, right? And indeed, this called for yet another intervention. And one can then start to blame the kind of like strategic ineptitude of these previous interventions, as it is itself part of the context in which further interventions in Syria emerged, I think. And it's, I think, in this context of basically military weakness that Israel and the United States cannot continue to engage in war directly themselves. They're just simply not good enough at it. And I think also strategic ineptitude. When they do intervene, it backfires on them, right? They don't get the results that they wanted, right? And I think it's in this context that the Yemen plan then sort of emerged as a matter of consensus, right? That it finally emerged as something that everyone could agree on, right? And here it simply says, yeah, we're not strong enough to do regime change. We're not strong enough to occupy and change this. We can't actually rebuild these societies. All we can do is mess them up, right? And dismember them territorially and promote their disintegration. We can't run them. We can only wreck them, right? And I think this is kind of where we're at with all this. And so now the strategic part of Plan B is not to get rid of Assad anymore, right? Assad suddenly doesn't have to go. He just has to stay in the western part of the country. The strategic plan now is to have two things, basically. A Kurdish entity in the northeast of Syria. And this has been, once again, there are like very strong Kurdish reasons why people want this, right? And the ubiquitous David Graeber, went to Rojava, described what a wonderful anarchist, canton-level, council-based democratic society it was. And I don't question that, right? What I do observe, however, is that this move to kind of, and initially the Rojava experiment was sort of neutral about whether it was going to be separate from Syria or contained within it. More recently, once it got like American air support when ISIS had it on the ropes at the end of 2014, they've been much more strident about being independent and have basically been used by the Americans as a proxy force up there, right? So the Kurdish entity, initially started out, in my view, as a very kind of noble quasi, council communist anarchist kind of experiment that nonetheless got geopolitically exploited by the Americans as a proxy force and is now, becoming something different. Immediately to the south of Rojava is the attempt, and this is why Deir ez-Zor is such a strategic site in the battle right now. There's the one Syrian government outpost in that part of Syria. The hope has been to establish a Salafist principality, a small, a Sunni fundamentalist entity that would geopolitically connect Qatar and all of the Gulf. It would allow that pipeline that Assad refused to build in 2009. So I got to end up here. This, I think, is if we want to understand why smashing the Syrian state is now on the agenda and what kind of geopolitical objectives it serves, I think these are the ones. And it shows that imperialism works in many strange and wonderful ways, right? It's not a one-note entity, right? You can make arbitrary boundaries and you can smash them when you are the masters of the universe. So thank you. Yeah.
So my name is Phil, and I'm talking about Palestine. A very different approach to the speakers we've just had. I'm presenting really information that forms part of my book, which is essentially about the state of Palestine that was proclaimed in 2011. 2012 at the UN General Assembly by the Palestinian Authority. You can see here an image here of President Mahmoud Abbas winning, great support and great applause from everybody. That the state of Palestine had apparently come into being 1 year after he'd requested that the General Assembly consider this. And actually a few years previous to that, in 2007, a whole process of state building had begun at the government level. So you can tell that my approach to this is much more at the domestic level. I'm talking really about Palestinian politics, which is about US imperialism, is about regional politics, because Palestine is an incredibly highly penetrated, it's not even a state, a country, I suppose. So let's start here. This is the paradox we have at the moment. We have a state of Palestine proclaimed, but as we know, there is essentially it is not a reality. There is no state of Palestine. It's still occupied. And I'll skip through these to keep it brief, but there's a question I'd like to pose to you. What does it mean to be a state? You think about Canada and what makes Canada a state. You might think of several factors, several things that determine statehood. I mean, autonomy over your own military, your currency, your population registry, freedom of movement within your own borders, the control of the borders, control over trade, control over taxes, a lot of things you can think of that make a state meaningful. And in Palestine, well, there aren't many of these visible. There is no military, there is no currency. You either use the Jordanian dinar or the Israeli shekel or the US dollar. Unfortunately, not the British pound, which is always a bit of a pain for me. No control over territory, no control over borders, not recognised by the big players. It may be recognised by 183 countries around the world in bilateral agreements, but not by the United States, not by the United Kingdom, not by Canada, and of course not by Israel, which maintains a belligerent occupation of both the West Bank and Gaza Strip along with the Golan Heights. And no ability to enforce or protect rights, of course. So what's going on here? For years we've been hearing about this. The Palestinian people must have their own state. They live in next to Israel in peace and security. So what's going on? Obama says it, Bush said it, Clinton said it. We've all been talking about having a Palestinian state for decades. And there they are at the UN General Assembly proclaiming a Palestinian state. Why is this not over? Well, it's not over for a lot of reasons. So in this little talk, I'm going to talk very briefly about what this means. And I'm taking I look at this through the lens of my research, which was based in the north of the West Bank. So I don't talk a lot about Gaza, although we can talk about Gaza if you'd like to. I think there's a lot to say and a lot of people know a lot about it. But I'll talk about what I know from the West Bank in particular, and from a place in the north, a very old and historic city called Nablus, which is a Roman city, and it used to be under the Ottoman Empire. It was a real centre for trade, and it's you walk around and the architecture is amazing, and it's such in many ways it's a symbol of what has been lost at the hands of imperialism over time. That this city has been cut off and is really becoming closed and very insular. So very briefly, I'm not going to talk about the history because we've already done that, but my sort of worldview, my philosophical outlook on this is that the basis of the conflict is one over territory and one over land in terms of the Israel-Palestine conflict. But in terms of the outer world, the imperial context, you see obviously a lining up of the world's great powers behind one side of this conflict, and a narrative that you see in the newspapers, particularly if you read the New York Times and Tom Friedman, of parity. And there is no parity between the two sides. You get enormous support from the international community towards Israel, and and as I will show you in a few minutes, a poison chalice of support for what is effectively a sort of a municipal government which claims to be a state. So what is it based on? Well, as I said, it's based on this a competition over territory and over population, and it's based, as Nahla was saying, essentially we're talking about the ethnic cleansing of Palestine, but it was on the conflict goes on because it was the incomplete ethnic cleansing of Palestine, and you identifying some of the processes you go on to try and sort of rectify what the Israelis would see as a problem in that. And you have the history of Palestinians in Israel governed under military rule, and Palestinians in the occupied territories now governed under military rule. And this is the territory we're talking about. So a military occupation, this is the day-to-day reality in the West Bank. This is a wonderful map created by the Israeli anthropologist Jeff Halper, and he calls it the matrix of control. And you can see here the division of territory, the network of roads, the network of settlements throughout the West Bank in particular, which maintain a division of territory and a control over almost every aspect of life. Control the air, control the energy supply, control the taxes, control the import and export of goods, as I said, and even the movement of people between. You would most often see this between cities, but historically, even a few years ago, it wasn't just the control of people moving between cities, it was people moving from their home to their university, or from their home to work, or from their home to their family's home, which is still a reality if you live in some parts of the West Bank, very much. So this is an overwhelming sense of control by an outside belligerent force. So a little map. This is a map that doesn't work. It's supposed to work, but it doesn't work. But here are some ways in which this control is manifest. And this is UN terminology, so I'll just go with that. It's a separation wall which cuts through the West Bank, which divides Palestinian territory from Palestinian territory. Even that recognised under international law, encloses whole areas. You've got restrictions on movement, you've got the growth of settlements, you've got settler violence, land seizures, house demolitions, arbitrary arrest and detention, a lack of border access, and division of certain cities, in particular Hebron, which is the largest city in the West Bank, which is split between a permanent settler population and a much larger Palestinian population. And what we can see from this map also is the way in which the territory is divided and the way in which large strategically significant areas are controlled by Israel exclusively. For instance, the Jordan Valley, which is this area just on the border of Jordan, obviously, and the Dead Sea, which is the most agriculturally significant part. But you can also see the control over Jerusalem around here, this large area here which cuts off the West Bank from Jerusalem, and you can see also these cutouts of territory all along the internationally recognised green line, the armistice line between what is Israel and is effectively the West Bank.
What's the difference between the grey and the white?
The grey, sorry, yes, of course. The grey is entirely under Israeli control. The white amalgamates areas A and B. And under international agreement in 1993, the territory was divided into 3 jurisdictions. Area A was put under under Palestinian administrative and security control, which is very small fragments. So, I don't think I can show you on this map, but perhaps on the previous one. So you see Area A is this colour here. So you got it around the major cities, and you can see the little Bantustans, pockets, an archipelago within the sea of occupation control. And then you've got Area B, which is under Palestinian administrative control and Israeli security control. And Area C, which is essentially directly occupied by Israel. I mean, they're all directly occupied to an extent, but you have these discriminations in legal practice of it. So what happens is that you get these islands of Palestinian areas surrounded in significantly cut off from anywhere else by Israeli control. And we can see that the settler population has also increased. This is going up to more than 500,000 in 2013 of I don't know if everybody's familiar, settlers. Under the Fourth Geneva Convention, settlers are illegal. They're Israelis who live in civilian housing protected by military forces in somebody else's country, effectively. It's without permission and using up resources. And if I had more time, we could talk about the disparity of resources that are utilized by settlers compared to Palestinians. But the basic point is that settlers are the settlement of the West Bank has been subtly and unsubtly, depending on the Israeli government at the time and sometimes the mood of the Israeli government, has been promoted as a policy to continue the settler colonialism of Palestinian territories. And this is what it looks like. Here we have the separation wall cutting off one area and another land. Here we have checkpoints. These are ubiquitous throughout the West Bank. The numbers go up and down. You can look at statistics on this. But if there are significant ones, in particular, for Palestinians who cross into Israel to go to work. This kind of image is daily. It's twice daily, and It used to be more within the West Bank, and they fluctuate. They come and they go. In particular, I used to have to go through one very regularly to go into Nablus and out of Nablus that looked a lot like that. So this is what occupation looks like, and of course you've got. Imagine driving down the street in Ottawa and you've got. Well, this may not be a joke. Maybe President Trump will send foreign troops here to check you're driving on in the way that this foreign army thinks you should be. Or to stop you and to check your ID. This is the reality. So what is this two-state solution? As I mentioned, it's been talked about for a long time, and I'm sure you've all heard of it. At its basic level, it's a partition of the land between Jews and Arabs, or Israelis and Palestinians. In reality, it's much more complicated than that. It's a political division of land, and as we've seen, it isn't really to create two countries. It's to create one country and allow it to maintain a strategic envelope over the populations that remain in what's left of another country. And it's been a failure. There have been 3 failures of this process, which began in the 1990s and has continued today. So that's 23 years. There's no peace, obviously. There's no real state in Palestine, as I've said. It's a non-contiguous. I put non-contagious. It's also that. Mostly under Israeli control. Somebody actually told me about this before and I forgot to change it, so it's my own fault. It's mostly under Israeli control, as you can see. Areas that are under Palestinian Authority control are effectively a police state, and this is where we get into the more complicated and real nugget of my research was about this nature of this police state. And the government, as I said, it's effectively a municipal government. He's somebody called President Abbas the mayor of Ramallah and not much else, which is essentially what he is. No basic improvement of rights for Palestinians. I've only got 2 minutes left, so I'm going to be very quick. So how do we go from this to this? This is the police state that operates in Palestine. And this is really what my research was about. It was about, while the Palestinian Authority was seeking this international recognition and this status of a state. At the same time, it was turning inward. It was becoming much more brutal and attacking its own people. And if we look at the time of the Arab Spring, a lot of literature you might have read in the popular press would be, where is the Palestinian Spring? I read dozens of articles like that. And it's true, there wasn't much protests comparable with Tunisia or Egypt or Syria or where else, but there were protests, and we can see this is the number of protests that I tracked, and we can see the number of days of protests throughout that 2-year period of 2011 to 12. More and more protests against the Palestinian Authority from its own people. And this is striking. You think about where the Palestinian Authority comes from. Its historical background is the PLO, which was the sole legitimate representative of the Palestinian people against the oppressor and aggressor Israel. And the Palestinian Authority is this government which lives by the will of Israel, effectively, and governs by the will of Israel and based on international funding. It's now governing the West Bank, and it is facing protests, and it is responding in this very brutal way to people. So what are the causes of this violence and this displeasure with the Palestinian Authority? And this really gets to, we were talking about imperialism working in weird and wonderful ways. This is the kind of thing. I would suggest it's not all about imperialism, but it is a large amount of it. And of course the context is the fact that Israel maintains a strategic envelope around all agency in Palestine, and of course this is backed up by an enormous amount of support from the United States at all levels. At diplomatic level, they provide diplomatic cover, they provide military aid, an enormous degree. Obama, who is seen as the most unpopular American president, has just negotiated increase to $3.8 billion a year for 10 years of military aid to Israel under exceptionally friendly conditions, better conditions than any other state, even other allies, Egypt for instance, would get. Anyway, so the Palestinian Authority lacks hegemony. It's not considered legitimate by its population that it governs, and it's deeply unpopular. It has deep-seated structural problems. As I said, its ability to act is limited by Israel's strategic envelope. It can't deal with issues, for instance, like poverty. There is no economic growth. and it's entirely aid dependent. And we can see the statistics here. $24.6 billion with US dollars worth of aid between 1993 and 2012 in international aid. So why isn't this working? Here's another example. The British government give more aid out of their Middle East aid budget to Palestine than anywhere else. So think about that paradox I said at the beginning. You've got people declaring a state, people giving enormous amounts of money to build a state, and there is no state. What is going on? Keep thinking about that, because this really is the question that drives all, underlies all of this. Well, let's look at what's going on. Where's this money gone? This is the GDP, a percentage change of GDP in the West Bank over 2000 to 2012. So that's 12 years. And in that time, of course, 2006, you've got a big schism where Hamas won the legislative elections, and you've got a cut-off in aid by the international community. And then in 2007, Fatah Mahmoud Abbas, the president, retook control effectively of the West Bank, and they lost control of Gaza. But all the aid that was directed to Gaza was redirected to the West Bank. So we have a spike, of course. Yeah, it's a lot of really good, isn't it? And then it drops off again. And we have, really, Palestine has done very little in terms of improvement against the regional average in terms of economic growth for that entire period. And it drops off again, you see. Fiscal instability, this is where, I told you the Palestinian Authority can't collect its own taxes. It does to a certain degree. It's more complicated than that. But for the most part, it doesn't. It is they suffer a problem which sounds extremely nasty, called fiscal leakage, which is when essentially there should be. I won't go into this anyway. Essentially, it means that if you're a government, every government suffers from fiscal leakage. It means that if you, it means don't sit on cold floors, I've been told. But no, essentially it means that you're supposed to collect a set amount of taxes from everybody, and then eventually that pays through your public services. And sometimes you have to pay more for the services you provide, and you go to debt, or sometimes you can't collect the taxes. For instance, if somebody who happens to be a billionaire, casino, a real estate mogul doesn't declare taxes over 10 years, then you don't get any taxes from them. That is fiscal leakage. The Palestinian Authority has a serious problem with fiscal leakage. And this is the current account balance of the Palestinian Authority. And part of that, and you can see, this is just, they don't collect the money they should. They can't collect the money they should, and they're entirely dependent on foreign aid. And we see, like in 2008, just after that redirection of aid from the international community, you get, for the first time since 2000, the Palestinian current account goes into the black. But it drops off again quite dramatically. Now think about that paradox. They're trying to build a state. If you were building a state, why would you give people a lot of money one year and then take it away the next year? It is, if you believe this about building a state, you're not paying attention. Average daily wage in the West Bank, I talked about poverty being a significant one. And you can see there is a minimum wage, which is supposed to be something like 2.1 US dollar equivalent per day. No, about 25%. No, it's not that high. I forget what it is exactly, but it's something like 25% of the population in the West Bank don't even reach the Palestinian Authority's minimum wage, and they have no ability to enforce their own laws, so it doesn't make any difference. We can see the poverty here. You look at public sector employment. This is a very big employer in the West Bank. About 180,000 people work for the public sector. About 50% work in the security services. And this is, as you can see, less than $1.1 a day. Private sector. There is no private sector. There's no entrepreneurship or anything like this in the West Bank, not because the Palestinians are not able to be entrepreneurs, but there's no opportunity. The private sector is dominated by large, wealthy families who made a lot of money in the Gulf, who own holding companies, and foreign investors who don't invest a great deal, and then the private sector. So the private sector wages have gone down. The highest you can get in terms of wages is if you work in Israeli settlements or work in Israel. So think about what this is doing to the dynamic here, is that you're better off working for your occupier than you are working for yourselves. Unemployment, again, you see the West Bank is way below, unemployment is much higher than the regional average again. And none of this is working. None of this aid, none of this state building is making a difference. And the legitimacy of governments, which is another important one. This is from polling from 2007, again when Fatah took over the West Bank again, to today. And you can see here, just for comparison, we have the Hamas government in black and the Palestinian Authority in the dotted line. And you can see by the end, it was less than 25% of the population believed the government was legitimate. That's not popular, that's legitimate. That's Justin Trudeau he should not be Prime Minister, not that he's a bad Prime Minister. So we can see there is, on every front we see then, that the state that is being attempted to build is not being built and is not seen to be built. And I would argue this is a product of a vicious cycle. For the Palestinian Authority, particularly, I remind you, I'm looking through this through the domestic lens, of course. There's no growth and no progress in terms of peace process. There's a greater dependence on foreign aid because there's no growth and because you have to buy people off. The government becomes less popular and it uses rents, effectively buys people off, and uses military force where it can, or security force, to maintain control within its own little bubbles. And this, of course, leads more to no growth and no progress, and the whole thing revolves around again and again. So state building, I would argue, this period, this claim of state building, this idea that we're building a Palestinian state is not building a Palestinian state, it's compounding the problem. It is donor-led, led by big actors in the international community, led by big governments, of course. You've got the Quartet, you've got the American government, obviously, which doesn't actually give an enormous amount of aid, but it directs the agenda, as the British play a big role in this, other actors do as well. But there's a strong focus on security. I wish I would have had time, I would have talked a bit more about that. Integration with the war on terror, which is the rhetoric of the 2000s, was particularly when it came towards dealing with Hamas, and undermining and overthrowing the election of 2006, the use of torture and so on. And a good quote here is that a police state is not a state. It's a form of larceny of people's rights, aspirations and sacrifices for the personal benefit of an elite. And yes, for the Palestinian elites, it is for their benefit relative to everyone else, but it is also a benefit to maintaining the status quo, the strategic envelope which is considered significant by Israel. So here's my summary. I'm not going to go through this too much, really. I think you've probably got the gist, and I've just gone over my 15 minutes, so I'm going to skip this bit. And there we have it, a little protest I saw outside Abbas's office, I think in 2014, I can't remember. And here we go. This is it. This is a normal guy on the street, and it's not only that he's putting up a protest to say no more solutions. He's doing it in English, in Ramallah, because he knows that Abbas isn't going to read it. It's for people like me to read it, the foreign journalists and the foreign academics who will go back and tell people that this state that everybody keeps talking about, this two-state solution, is an utter nonsense. Anyway, that's my time.
A crucial point that has not been discussed, so I'm going to throw it in, and that's the role of Russia.
Yeah.
And I would like to hear what you have to say about Plan B or Plan A, like vis-a-vis the various strategies of proxies planned for Syria, because Russians are aware of all this, including the plan, the caliphate for Dar ez-Zor. You know, this is why there was the attack against the. And the Russians absolutely will not allow that, including the Kurdish enclave. Yeah. You can count on. So what does that mean then? Could this then continue as being proxy? Because the Russians are pushing it for it to clarify itself. Yes.
No, I mean, I would have loved to have got to that if I hadn't already been going on too long. I think the first thing to say about Russia is, at the risk of saying something good and being a Putinista Satanist, is that they were invited to come in and intervene in this situation. And, I think they have their own somewhat selfish motives. I'll get to those. But the ostensible motives, which I don't discount either, is that They basically don't want illegal regime change to be going on, and they also say, that we don't want, that some of these jihadis come from Chechnya, they're ours. We'd rather be fighting them here than having them come back home or attack us through Kazakhstan and the sort of southern underbelly of Russia. So. But I think there's very definitely an agenda of maintaining self-determination as an important principle, national self-determination. I think there is also a more self-interested one. I mean, if that pipeline is built from Qatar through to Europe, that negatively affects Gazprom and the Russian enterprise there. So I'm not saying they're angels or without interests of their own. But I think that basically they've been invited in. They've absolutely changed the tide in that war, but are very careful not to intervene so much that they become the sole authors of what's going on. They're actually refusing to bomb in Aleppo for the last 3+ weeks, not because the Syrians don't want them to, because they said, no, you guys do it, right? So, I basically admire the role of Russia in this, but I don't think it's, entirely altruistic, entirely, but pretty much. And I compared to the other side, it's been remarkably principled, right? And has I think it's saving lives, frankly.
Yeah, but the Russian pullback on the bombing is also caused by the threat of more what do you call them, sanctions.
Sure.
Pushed by the Brits, the Americans, and others.
Yeah.
So it's not totally
of course.
unmotivated.
Yeah, no, I would agree with that. And I think the other thing is that there's a propaganda war at work here, and I think Putin does not want to pour fuel on the fire of, of the ongoing narrative of indiscriminate bombing, Assad drops barrel bombs, Putin indiscriminately, all of this kind of, I think he's actually trying to make a point here, right? And part of the point is, look, we opened up these humanitarian corridors and nobody came out and no supplies were allowed in, right? And I think he's trying to make that point as well.
What about the convoy that was bombed?
Yeah, well, who bombed it? It certainly wasn't done from the air, right? That's the one thing that is pretty clear. So I don't know. I wasn't there, but I certainly don't. Lots of people have argued that if you look at the pattern of the damage, it's not there were no craters of the sort that you expect from a bomb drop from the air, right? Looks more like it was done from the ground. And if that's the case, that does narrow down the potential culprit somewhat, right? Yeah.
I have a comment. I don't think I like to comment in situations like this. So I'm going to try and couch my question in a comment and work interchangeably between those two. I guess initially, well, I appreciate certainly you're playing kind of a counter narrative to some of this perception of propaganda, and I agree and I appreciate that that's certainly something that's refreshing in terms of how we understand the propaganda in Syria. At the same time, I still view this, from my perspective at least, this aspect that's disingenuous to somehow say that I think there's a gap missing in part of your narrative between 2011 and 14 about the opposition is just kind of colored by these terrorist organizations, whether or not it's Jabhat al-Sham, Arar al-Sham, Daesh, etc. I think that we need to probably recognize the fact that 200,000 civilians killed by regime forces in an area that typically tends to stifle out any legitimate opposition. And I think breeds extremism, and I don't think that's necessarily a stretch to insinuate, that anybody who could form a legitimate opposition in Syria is chased out of there long ago. And I think that anybody who's remaining is probably coming up under a serious military intervention that's probably hard to breed anything of any legitimacy. So I guess in that respect, I feel like there still needs to be a nod to, in terms of civilian casualties, and recognition on one side that it's not just, all sides have their hands dirty. I think that there's a very, very legitimate claim to say that the majority of civilian casualties have been committed by the Syrian regime. Secondly, that leads to your aspect about Russia and kind of, you think they're playing this moral role here. Fair, but at the same time, we probably need to identify that when we're talking about imperialism, what's the role then for the West to deal with Russia in this situation? Is there an engagement role for the West to have some dialogue with Russia in this case? And secondly, I guess that now moving forward with the Trump regime, is there something that regime rather, sorry, the Trump administration, is there Freudian slip? What should be a Western approach to the conflict in Syria?
Well, I would say let's reinstate principles of self-determination, and that would be an answer to several other points that you raised. I mean, let's recognize that there actually was an election in the summer of 2014 in Syria, and that Assad won it quite handily. Let's also recognize that, I don't know where you're getting these figures about the majority of civilian casualties being, I don't know, but I'm not saying that I know better, right? But certainly what I would say is that people tend to vote with their feet under these circumstances. In other words, when you're dealing with a civil war and life is being made, very, very difficult to impossible on the ground, people go to places where they think they won't be treated quite as badly. And if you look particularly at the case of Aleppo, the vast majority of the population there was actually pro-government and has tried to escape. The jihadi held parts of Aleppo, for example, have been, during these last 3 weeks, these corridors were opened up, people were not allowed out, and the reports were that they'd be shot if they tried to leave. So I think it's very complicated. The proverbial fog of war and all of that. Like I say, I'm not going to claim that I definitively know better than what you're saying here, but I am going to say that it seems like the majority of the civilian population has taken refuge not in jihadi-held areas, but in government-held areas, and that to me does say something about where they expect a reasonable treatment. But yeah, I'm not saying that everything about the Assad government is wonderful or that I'd like to live under it personally, right? For me, the issues at stake here are, in a sense, a lot cruder and more fundamental, and I would come back to, rights of self-determination. So I think the main role for the West is to get out, Yeah.
Well, thank you all three speakers for your presentations. To continue on in the case of Syria, there's no question that the objective in Syria is regime change and the process via proxy surrogates. But my main takeaway, if I understood you correctly from your presentation, is that you seem to be arguing that ISIL was or is a Western surrogate, or at least a Western creation. And if that's the case, how do you explain ISIL attacks on Western interests on the one hand, and continued Western war against ISIL, including specifically against its leadership?
Yeah, well, I would point out that it's a long-established pattern, right? Of one sees this with Al Qaeda. It was originally, CIA funded, and then turned against the U.S. So it's like this is part of a very long story. The second thing I'd say is don't take my word for it, right? Take Hillary Clinton's word for it. In part of one of the WikiLeaks dumps from, probably I think it was about 10 days ago. There's, she is saying, on her own, the privacy of her own server, that she knows full well that ISIS and also al-Nusra are being funded by Qatar and Saudi Arabia and all of this, and but she nonetheless continues to accept campaign donations, broker massive arms deals, like the biggest one in history, dwarfing anything even to Israel. What was it, like $115 billion worth of arms to Saudi Arabia? I mean, just an astronomical amount. So I actually would contest a little bit. I mean, ISIS has been remarkably restrained in attacking American targets, actually, right? I would say there's and certainly never attacked Israeli ones, nor has al-Nusra. And this is it seems to me shows that there is a geopolitical alignment of these groups, even though of course they resent their paymasters at another level. Of course they're at another level willing to turn on them under certain circumstances, right? But not these ones when they're being directly supplied militarily by them, right? And they are largely mercenaries, so I mean there's a certain material constraints on what they can do while they're being paid. And when Russia started bombing the oil tankers that were moving across from Syria into Turkey, that destroyed independent sources of financing for ISIS, right? And that changed the calculations and underlined the dependency to a greater degree. So I actually think they've kind of fallen into line, right? And if you want to cite counterexamples, great. I could be wrong about some things.
Could the panelists talk a little bit about the role of Iran and the objectives of Iran in the conflict? And also, could you expand a bit on the objectives of Saudi Arabia, Qatar, and the other Gulf states? And is there what pressure is the West putting on the states to stop the funding of, the arms trade and all that stuff? I wonder if you could, however you would like
This
to
is a
divide
good
that up.
question actually for the Syrian expert, but I have, I can say something, I can address this question. In terms of, to begin from the end actually, in terms of what kind of pressure or what kind of policies is the US, for example, putting on states like Saudi Arabia, Qatar, Bahrain, the Gulf area altogether, and Turkey, to stop sending, members of ISIS, to stop sending military, to stop militarizing and training people and sending them there, to stop in terms of Turkey, for example, accepting all the oil that has been stolen literally from Syria and brought into Turkey, as well as to stop Israel from giving medical aid to Al-Qaeda members, Al-Qaeda namely Al-Nusra. Al-Nusra equal Al-Qaeda. The US has not been able to do this because it is in the interest of the US, I think, to continue the destabilization of Syria itself, because it's part of the whole project. As I think what I started to say and what Peter continued to say is that the U.S. or imperialism in general has different phases and different faces or shapes. So the new shape here is not necessarily to redraw the borders, but rather to keep the borders as they are and redraw sort of hegemonic areas within the border. So dividing Syria, for example, into Shia, into Druze, into Sunni, into Kurds, is very much in the interest of both, actually, the US as well as Israel. Israel has always dreamt of having really religious states around it to justify also the Jewishness of the state. These relationships are extremely close. As for the earlier question of where does Iran come in, Iran has been, and no one would say no about this, or would Iran has been a great supporter of, if you want, Hezbollah in Lebanon. And had it not been for the Iran support of Hezbollah, the 2006 Israeli war, which devastated a large part, not only of the south, but also of Beirut, had it not been for the military aid from there, Israel would have basically decimated the whole area and stayed there. So it is that kind of support, if you want, whether we like it or not. Now, do I support the regime in Iran? No, I don't. But that is beside the point. The point is, what kind of a global role, or if you want, a regional role, has Iran been playing there? And also, Iran has been a great supporter in maintaining, if you want, the Syrian, whatever state remains as a state, whatever integral territory as it is. Again, without the support of Iran and, of course, Russia and Hezbollah to the Syrian, Syria cannot really fight 85 countries. These people who are there, known as whether ISIL or ISIS or IS or Jabhat al-Nusra or Al-Qaeda or Fath al-Sham, there are 150 different organizations from all over the world, including Chechnya, including the Baltic region, and from all over the world. Had it not been for the support that it has been getting from Iran, it would not have stood until today. There have been, I'm sure you know, years 2014, 2013, 2014. And actually from the very beginning, we used to hear, okay, in 1 week, the Syrian regime will collapse, Assad will be gone, Syria will be under our control. Then in a month, then in a year. Now it has been standing now for 6 years. So once again, this is one way of talking about it. Now you want to ask me about the regime itself and its problems and problematics and corruption or whatever it is, I'll go with you on this.
What was
and I'll
the
agree.
question? No.
The question was a different question,
Yeah.
and I just tried to.
Yeah. Thank you.
I just want to follow up on that a little bit because I came back from the summer of being in Lebanon. And one of the things that I want to kind of pull together some of the things around the destabilization of the region, and it kind of goes back to your question around civilians being killed and humanitarian issues, is you have a country of about 3.9 million people that now has about 1.9 million refugees that are Syrian. And that's in addition to the refugees that came from Iraq and the Palestinian refugees who have been struggling to survive in Lebanon for many decades now. And one of the things that, and Peter, I think you touched on it a little bit, and Nahla as well, is that Lebanon in many ways has been able to stave off the kinds of attacks that have been in other regions, in part because of Hezbollah and the policies that have taken place in Lebanon and the support from Iran. But at the same time, the kind of strong arming that's happening from the United States, for example, in the summer, they forced what was left of Lebanon to take the Hezbollah funds that were in the bank and put a hold on them so that they couldn't get the money. And immediately after that took place, there was a bombing at one of the major Beirut banks as a result of it. Now there's a new government in Lebanon that's 1 week old that consists of a partnership between Michel Aoun, the president, the Christian president, Saad Hariri, the Sunni president, and Nasrallah, Hezbollah. How do you see that shaping the politics of the region now, and how do we contend with 1.9 million refugees when European borders are closed and tiny countries like Lebanon and Jordan and Turkey are being forced to take in these huge numbers with no real financial support? I mean, my prediction is more conflict taking place in those regions. I mean, I was there from the Bekaa Valley all the way to the Israeli border in the south. You see streets of refugees that have put up tents and shanties, and not even under UN kinds of frameworks. How do you see that happening? What do you see happening there with all of the new politics taking place? And Donald Trump in America. I mean, for me, the forecast doesn't look great.
No, it's hard to be optimistic about it. I've read one analysis today about the Obama-Trump meeting of yesterday that says that they have finally agreed to start going after al-Nusra, which has been something the U.S. has been very, very reluctant to do. So if, and that's a big if, that is to be the case, and if there's going to be Russian-American cooperation at long last, as has been agreed upon but not delivered so many times, that potentially could change it. But yeah, what can you do? Clearly, for refugees, the thing has to be stabilizing the situation in Syria. I'm sure most of them don't want to live in Europe, right? But they don't want to live in a war zone either. So it's easy to say, but very hard to do. They need peace, right?
An answer, a naive answer actually, might be something that I have been dreaming of for many years as a Palestinian, is that we need a Palestine for all the Palestinian refugees to go back to, and because this is what they need. Now, whoever goes back is fine. Whoever doesn't want to go back and stay wherever they are, it's also fine. But at least the right to be able to go back to your country. I think the same naive hope, if you want, I carry with your question. I bet you that most Syrian refugees in Lebanon and Jordan and wherever they are actually, they really want to go back.
Yes.
But for them to be able to go back, there should be some sort of hands off Syria. And this is what we have somewhere at the end of our poster actually. Hands off Syria, let Syria, reestablish itself, help it to reestablish itself, help it to rebuild what you have ruined basically, or helped in ruining, helped in destroying. And I think, the question of the refugees would be solved in a natural and peaceful way of going back. But to say that Lebanon, who's half of the population of refugees, Lebanon cannot deal with them, nor Jordan can deal with them, nor any other country should be dealing with them. I bet you a large number of the 30,000 or 25,000 that we brought here in Canada, I don't think they are, happily ever after. These people have, many of them, especially if they are in Damascus or towards Aleppo, have never seen the snow. And they're going to be really terrified by this, weather here. They're not going to be your happy sort of children, or the children might play with it because it's a game, right? It's something to play with. But more than that, it's going to be really, I don't want to say disastrous, but very tough for Syrian refugees anywhere else. For all kinds of reasons, from housing to economics to culture to everything. Like most, forced refugees, if you want, or forced immigrants or forced migrants. These are forced refugees. They're not immigrants to Canada. They're not migrants. They are people who are forced to leave their own homes and come here. So you need really a situation in Syria whereby make it possible and available for all of these people. Build it again or rebuild it again and bring them back. And I bet you most of them will go back. This has been at least the experience of Palestinians, many of whom continue to say until this moment, I want to go back after 70 years. Next year it would be 70 years, not just 1 year or 5 years. So I could see this. It's naive, maybe. It's a hope, maybe. It's a dream, maybe.
Well,
but I'm allowed to dream.
I think one of the things is that Lebanon learned is that many people did go back after the peace accord. They did go back, they rebuilt, they started businesses, and then
Right.
2006 came,
Yeah,
and everything that was rebuilt was re-destroyed.
that's true.
And most people who came back on the evacuations stayed wherever they were evacuated to. They said, not going back again. And the reality is, the rebuilding of that country hasn't taken place. They still have no power plants. They lose electricity every 3 hours. Garbage is everywhere. They have no removal. They don't know where to put it. The water system's down. So I guess, I know you got a dream, but I guess my question is, how real is rebuilding? How real is repatriating refugees back to where they came from and assisting them in the context of not resolving major regional stability issues?
It's a tough question. It's a very important question, but a tough one. But you know what? One would ask, why is it that these huge global powers with billions and trillions of dollars, why do we accept their legitimate attempt at spending so much money at arming, let's say, Saudi Arabia, so in turn it can arm, all of these terrorists in Syria and in other places, in Yemen, Libya, etc. Okay? Instead of doing that, how about some of this money spent on humanitarian issues, on helping children, really helping the men and women actually in Syria, in Lebanon, etc. I mean, Lebanon has not really received any substantial amount of financial aid to deal with the new wave of immigrants. Similarly with Jordan. Syrian refugees in Jordan are living in the most miserable situation in an area, a desert area, between an uninhabited area between Jordan and Syria. I mean, there are no schools, no roofs, above their heads. They're hungry. Women are being raped. Children are being married to older people. All of the evils in the world is happening to these, refugees. So, some of our money, instead of going, for more capital here, to enrich, the neoliberal, capitalist, imperialist countries, let's redirect them into something else. But that's also another type of thinking that, does not seem to be the currency here.
Thank you.
Welcome.
Yeah, I had a question for the second speaker. A lot of the social rhetoric that I've seen about the North Kurdish people in Syria is that they're proxies influenced by mainly Iran and somewhat Russia. Now, in your presentation, you mentioned that there's also American influence there a lot. I personally haven't seen that in the social media that much, and I was just wondering if you can expand on that.
Well, first of all, I wouldn't. An Iranian influence is, I'm not aware of that. But certainly it is, I think, justifiably celebrated as a heartland of a kind of, again, canton-based, kind of anarchistic, self-organized economy and militias. And so, the YPG and so forth are tied up with that. They're a thorn of course, the Kurds are a thorn in the side to all the nation states in this area because they overlap with Turkey, Iran, Iraq, and Syria, right? So if they are to gain a state or a quasi-state or an autonomous zone in any one of those states, it will, presumably have a threatening or potential knock-on effect in all the others. So they're kind of universally suspected because of their nationalist ambitions in that regard. With regard to the American connect, so, again, I think they were very prudent in the early part of the post-2011 period when the Syrian state was essentially collapsing, and it enabled them to have an autonomous zone during this time, and they were able to set up, to organize themselves as they wished, and but they were very careful at that moment to say, we're not declaring independence. We're kind of neutral as to whether we're part of Syria or whether we're independent. We're just going to do our thing. Irrespective of what a state we're a part of or whether we're part of a state at all. Okay. But they were attacked quite severely by ISIS in 2014 and really driven right onto the Turkish border. And it's at that point that the Americans came in and gave them air cover, and they started to reverse the tide against ISIS. And it's at that moment that a geopolitical alliance, and I don't blame the Kurds in Rojava for doing that. They were about to be squeezed out of existence, and so that was a lifeline, and they took it. Right? I don't blame them for that. However, I think it's had some consequences. Right? I think it was a poison chalice. I think we've been kicking that around a little bit here. It was consequential that they took that aid, and I think it's compromised them somewhat since. But they've been an effective, proxy force against ISIS for the Americans when they wanted to, hold it in check in that area. And now now that there's a need for America to show that it's making progress against ISIS because of the, hypocrisy and all of this, it's been useful to the Americans to have the Kurds as a force, and that proceeded up until, the very end, approximately August of this summer. At which point the Turks put their foot down and didn't want Afrin province and Rojava to join up along the Turkish border there, because that would be too threatening to Turkey, and the U.S. had to take that seriously, and so the thing has been thrown into reverse somewhat, and now endless thing. But I mean, there is. I think a de facto, I won't say alliance, but a accord of some sort with the Kurds and the Americans in Syria right now. How long it will last, there's clearly not identical interest there. I think there's something conjunctural about it. I mean, we'll see, right? I think that could break apart, but it's held for a few years.
I just wanted to also make a point that it was interesting, the fact that according to Hillary Clinton's leaked emails, how they're influencing ISIS, and then the Kurds are also fighting, within themselves. So proxies are kept in check by the same financer if the allegations were true.
Yeah, right. So it's just the same, foment conflict and divide and rule kind of scenario. Yeah.
Okay, I guess we are going to complete the formal part of our discussion. We are staying here for the informal part, so I would like to thank you all for being here. You can stay with us. You don't have to leave. So thank you very much.